Every clinician wants to provide their clients with the best care possible. And so we rely on evidence from research and then the translation of that research into best practices and treatment guidelines. But what is evidence-based when the research is biased? Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Victoria Franz. I'm a clinical psychologist on the PESI team. There are serious limitations in the research on body image and eating disorders. That's why we at PESI have developed the upcoming Body Image Summit, which will be held on February 24th and 25th. There, 21 experts will teach you what you need to know to deliver interventions that are trauma-informed, as well as inclusive and affirming of race, gender identity, sexuality, body size, ethnicity, and culture. I'm so pleased to introduce you today to one of our experts, Jessica Wilson. Jessica's talk at the summit will focus on the missing links in research and treatment for Black women struggling with body image issues and eating disorders. With 15 years experience as a clinical dietitian, Jessica has led international dialogues about the barriers that marginalized clients face when accessing eating disorders care. And she's well known for co-founding the Amplify Melanated Voices movement. Welcome, Jessica. We're so glad you're with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. I'd love to get your insights. Can you tell us first what has most surprised you about weight bias and racism in research and healthcare?
I think the thing that ties the two of them together always is who is doing the research, right? So for weight stigma and weight bias in research, rarely is it folks most impacted by weight stigma. And similarly for Black folks with eating disorders, so rarely is the researchers representing the population as well. I see that especially for eating disorder research, because when we're looking at, say, the rates of eating disorders in Black women, we're always using the comparison to, white peers, like the standard, like what everything is held up to. Is going to be those with dominant identities, and then everyone else is supposed to somehow measure up. So even in those little bits, like we don't really notice the bias in the research. And so we're always asking the same questions for those who are marginalized that we do for those with dominant identities. And I think that in and of itself, for both weight stigma and for Black women, particularly with eating disorders, leads to a lot of research questions that aren't really relevant and giving us the answers that we need at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's disheartening to have a sense that the research doesn't hold up for everyone.
Right. And that it really isn't intended to. I find that for Black women, for gender diverse folks, like it's really more of an add-on, like we still want to center those with dominant identities, but we really, shouldn't or can't ignore other folks. So we're just going to like sprinkle them in to like what already exists and not really change the paradigms or the treatments or the interventions at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, when really, ideally, the whole paradigm would shift to be inclusive of everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you tell us what are some of the stories that you hear in your practice from Black women about their experiences with body image?
Yeah, I think it's important always to look at how we frame body image. For those with dominant identities, it's like a self-perception about how I feel about my body. Even in, I believe, the diagnosis for anorexia, it's like a personal disturbance with my own body weight. And that one works for people for whom like they are thin and white, right? So they're not getting, the same messages about their body like from everyone. around them that their body is the problem. But for folks, especially Black women, gender diverse folks, the messages aren't necessarily internal. It's like every time we leave the house, like our bodies are being appraised, they're being policed by those around us. And so any disturbance that we have is likely not like of self-perception. But when we treat body image, it's always like we want you to feel better about your body. And I always say, like, I can feel fine, but like I still have to leave, and like, how does, restriction or other things really create that, unfortunately, like safety and survival skills in a society that really wants Black women to make ourselves small? Yeah. So I hear that from my clients, how just really interventions aren't meeting their needs. Oftentimes our interventions are really also thin focused. So, the reinforcement of larger bodies as, less desirable bodies, because we don't want to use things like fat talk, which inherently, means that fatness is a negative, thing to be. And a lot of the other perhaps stories of, just job safety and personal safety survival. I've had, some clients who will say, I am restricting because I need to enter the job force and I can't be the only Black person and be fat, which is just the reality. And so then using like the same type of, interventions and body image discussions just aren't going to meet the needs of people whose reality is very different.
Definitely. So what would you say are some of your top tips as to how we can better serve Black women in treatment settings where body image and eating are at the forefront? I imagine that's a huge question that you could respond to for hours. But I'm curious about kind of what would you boil that down to in terms of some nuggets of advice?
I always think that contextualizing experience is really valuable. So oftentimes when people come in to talk to me, like they've been doing their, online research, looking at social media to see themselves reflected, and often get caught up in the narrative that like diet culture is the problem, when for them, it could be racism that is the primary problem. So contextualizing like their experience and not pathologizing it is what, I think is most important, not making it a problem. Like your eating disorder or however you're, viewing your body makes sense in the context of our society. So let's step back and let's not, let this be on you, right? You didn't create this. This is, of course, not your fault. This is a product of the environment in which, we all have to live. So I get that feedback, that contextualizing and making people feel more comfortable knowing it's not, something that has happened on their own or their fault, I think is really important. And I think like discarding the interventions that were not created with Black women or any other marginalized folks at the center is a good way to go forward and actually meet the needs of the client that's in front of me. Right? Because like applying these, frameworks or other things that were not meant to support my clients actually will do them a disservice in the long run, rather than actually assessing like what they need in order to survive, right? It's not just about how they feel about their body. So what do we do? How do I support them? That may look like a whole other set of resources in community building that I just wouldn't think about. And the typical like body positivity, messages aren't going to resonate.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the harm that might be done without tailoring treatment to the client in front of you, using some of those mainstream.
Yeah, some specific folks. Honestly, I just see people who don't get better, right? I might be their third dietitian that they've seen. I've also gotten that feedback, like until meeting you, I just didn't think I was ever gonna get better in my eating disorder. But something else that I will recommend to folks is finding therapists and dietitians that share your identity, because without that, indeed, we continue just to perpetuate the individual as the problem. When we don't take the step back, we continue to, lay blame, and we don't recognize that just talking to somebody and like sharing that you can feel better about yourself really just makes that person feel like they're doing something wrong. It puts it on them to feel or to gain the agency, but that's just not the primary concern. So we're also, erasing their experience, making them, like in group settings, like fit into the narrative, which is just requiring to leave, all of their experiences at the door in order to fit.
Yeah, treatment should not be about fitting in.
Right. And
finding your way to health and to wellness.
and being made to share experiences. I find that oftentimes too. People will say, like, I just had to keep quiet about the like institutional racism in treatment. Otherwise, I would be labeled as non-compliant or a problem, and like insurance wouldn't cover it anymore. So I just had to play along and hope for the best.
Wow. So we probably have time for me to ask you one more question.
Sure.
So looking forward to your talk and hearing more. When and how, Jessica, should clinicians bring the concept of racial harm into conversations about disorder?
Yeah, I speak about this a bit more because this is a really hard one, first of all. So this requires like a big conversation and also a lot of self-assessment with comfort. But what I will find with clients who are Black and or brown, and then also for larger clients, oftentimes the clinician will acknowledge their privilege at the beginning and then move on. Like, it is never like, I have done this, we have said this, like, let's go back to the typical conversations I have, rather than bringing it up every time like it is present. And so clinicians needing to explore all of the different ways that dominant identities, pervade our treatment, how they pervade their assessment. So I always say like consistently and regularly in a way that makes sense. So not that I'm just like dumping like racism as a problem every time, but when people are talking about the ways that they're navigating the world, sometimes it can be helpful to recognize like, I see the impacts of white supremacy and say capitalism on the ways that your reality is just different than others, rather than just listening to somebody without providing that context. So rather than just bringing it up at the beginning and then like figuring that the client is going to bring it up, and those type of power dynamics, that just is not going to happen a lot of the time.
Yeah, we so look forward to hearing your full talk at the Body Image Summit coming up again February 24th and 25th. Jessica, thank you so much for being here with us today. It was a pleasure to talk with you some. And if you're interested in hearing more from Jessica, you still have time to register for the upcoming summit. And as a thank you for watching, we've included a promo code here on your screen. So we're looking very much forward to seeing you there. Have a great day, everyone.